Hello, I'm Hilary Cremin from the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge, and this is Rewilding Education. Rewilding Education is a discussion-based podcast in which I talk to other thinkers about the challenges facing our education system and how this invites us to think big and radically about how it might need to change. Each episode is recorded with a live audience who offer their own thoughts on the problems education needs to confront and some different solutions and what they might look like. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Luke Kemp. Luke is an affiliate of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and his work examines past civilizational collapse and future risk. His recent book, Goliath's Curse, offers a radical retelling of human history, asking why societies fail and how we might avoid a similar fate. Together with our audience, Luke and I focus on how we can educate for existential threats, issues like the climate crisis, biosecurity threats, and the prospect of devastating future wars. Each of these, or a combination of any of them, could trigger a societal breakdown. So I want to know how our education systems might respond and how we can equip young people with the knowledge, capabilities and qualities that give them hope of confronting such challenges. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Education is about the future. It's about the next generation. And so everything that we do in and through education, through our research, through our teaching, has an impact on the future. And I'm really hoping that Luke will help us to think about that and to think about what our response should be. So Luke, welcome to the faculty.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me, Hilary.
I'm going to start with an anecdote, if I may.
Please.
So I'm ashamed to say that I have a terrible habit. And my terrible habit is falling asleep in front of the television. I'd like to tell you that this is late at night, but it really isn't. And a few days ago, I fell asleep. And when I woke up and looked at the television that was still on, there you were.
You can't escape me.
I know. Do you want to tell us about that?
I presume this was the BBC Civilization series?
Yeah.
So Monday there was a launch of the latest reboot of BBC Civilizations, which is a landmark program initially launched, I believe, in 1964. Okay. And this new reboot is essentially focused on historical collapse. It's called Civilization, Rise and Fall. And it covers 4 different civilizations, if you will, throughout history, including Rome, the Aztec Empire, Japan, just before the Meiji Restoration, and Ptolemaic Egypt. I've only watched 1 episode so far, but I thought that was pretty good. So I'm also, contractually obliged to say you should watch it. I'm actually not, but either way, hopefully it's good.
It was very good, yes, it was very good. So Goliath's Curse. Tell us about what is the concept behind your book and the title?
Most of you probably have 2 questions here. First of all, what is a Goliath? And the second is, what curse is it afflicted by? When you go to write a book about the history and future of societal collapse, you're naturally struck by the question, what exactly is collapsing? And the usual answer is civilization. The problem is, once you try to look at the definition of civilization, it's quite clear they have some dramatic shortcomings. The definitions are either usually A, way too vague, things like a checklist of different factors, whether it be long-distance trade, which technically all hunter-gatherers have, or writing, which the Incan Empire, which stretched all the way from Chile to Argentina, did not have, or they tend to be frank, pretty biased and often racist. So one classic definition is an advanced culture, which I'm sure many indigenous people dispute. And the other problem is that when you actually look empirically at what marks the first cradles of civilization, the Shah dynasty in China, Uruk in Mesopotamia, the first dynasty of Egypt, the thing that really changes is we go from egalitarianism towards a social blueprint based upon domination. You start to see the emergence of kings, commanders, standing armies, bureaucracies, etc. It's more or less the emergence of a dominance hierarchy, a situation in which one individual is ranked above others, or a group is ranked above others, and uses force and violence to extract resources from them and impose rules. And we can bicker about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think the much more appropriate term for this is what I call Goliath. Obviously, harkening back to the biblical story, it's a large, intimidating figure, one that rules through force, but is also surprisingly fragile. And a Goliath, to me, is a collection of different dominance hierarchies. Rome was not just the empire, it was also the distinctions that we had between man and woman, slave and master, rich and poor. So that's a Goliath, essentially these big civilization-type units, the Goliaths that began to emerge 5,000 years ago. And their curse is that inequality tends to make them more vulnerable over time. In the book, I essentially track over 400 different states and show that almost every single one are preceded by rises in wealth inequality, which have a whole bunch of knock-on effects ranging from some things you already mentioned, things like polarization, social precarity, what people often call popular immiseration, what we now today call the cost of living crisis, through to things like intra-elite competition, oligarchy constraining decision-making, and many others. But you see this all the way from the very first farming communities in cities through to the largest empires, such as the Han Dynasty in China and the West Roman Empire. But the long story short is that wealth inequality tends to rise inextricably until eventually the state is captured, hollowed out, and then more or less rendered apart through a combination of different shocks, things like climate change, disease, and invaders. Yeah. And that is the curse of Goliath, that it has the seeds of its own demise.
Thank you. And I remember in your book, you mentioned the particular role of leaders, and you said 3 qualities that leaders have that we can see in Goliath empires that have already gone into decline. Could you say a little bit more about that?
In the book, I make a point that most of the evidence points towards most of us being pretty decent. When you look at how people behave during disasters, for instance, we tend to be pretty kind, altruistic, and good at self-organising. And similarly, we wouldn't have made it through the Paleolithic if we were constantly killing each other and incapable of organising during a disaster. It's an evolutionary recipe for a dead end. However, there are what I call the darker angels of our nature, which in the book I refer to as several different characteristics, one being status competition. All of us want status to a certain extent. We want to be loved and admired and respected by people around us. But only a small number are willing to go to great lengths to get it, and are willing to use violence, intimidation, bullying, and force to get it. Which brings us to another dark angel, what I call the dark triad. That is essentially a collection of different antisocial personality traits, including narcissism, Machiavellianism, lesser known but essentially the willingness to use others for political ends, and psychopathy, a lack of empathy and remorse. And my argument in the book is that we tended to over-select for people in the dark triad. People in the dark triad tend to want positions of authority and power much more, and they're usually much more successful at getting it as well. And even today, we see that, at least across the population of males today, roughly 1% of the general population would pass the clinical threshold for psychopathy. In boardrooms and parliaments, it's roughly 3 to 21%. There's a good chance that historically that was even worse, when you had less checks and balances, less democratic procedures, etc., etc. But in general, we tended to over-select for what represents the worst in us rather than the best. And that probably goes to explain why our institutions, our corporations and states often also don't seem to represent the best of us.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And so let's look at what are the existential threats that mean that we could be in the last generations of humanity. Would you mind just sort of, without, this is going to get depressing, we'll move on to the positive stuff in a bit, but let's get it all out. What are the most significant threats that we face, and why do you feel that they are existential threats?
I'll first of all do the very nerdy academic thing and say, let's talk about definitions. Naturally, most of us have a common sense definition of an existential threat is the threat to the existence of an object. And I think most of you, when you're talking about it, you went towards things which are obviously close to you. The education system, individuals, etc. In my field of study, we think of existential threats essentially as threats to the existence of global industrialized society or humanity as a species. So essentially things that could either cause global societal collapse or, in the very worst case, long-term human extinction. When we talk about threat, we're talking about a very particular force which causes damage. And the typical ones we talk about when it comes to the present world are climate change, of course, nuclear weapons, of which we have roughly 10,000 currently today, AI, usually more the idea of an advanced superintelligence, a machine that is so capable and so intelligent that can essentially outsmart and potentially even enslave humans or kill them all off. And also things like engineered pandemics. So essentially using modern day technology and synthetic biology, things like CRISPR-Cas9, to create a pandemic that is far worse than anything that would occur in nature. Some of these threats, obviously in the case of AI and bioengineered pandemics, are more speculative than others, such as climate change and nuclear weapons. But I think it's worthwhile remembering that these are all being birthed by a particular type of system. In the book, I really try to go beyond thinking about the individual threats and thinking, what's actually causing all of these? In 1945, if this Centre for the Study of Existential Risk existed, I'd have had a pretty easy job. All I had to study was nukes. And now today, I have colleagues studying this entire panoply of different threats. And if you want to be across all of them, you have to know a bit of computer science, a bit of synthetic biology, etc. The key question is, why do we keep on creating these different threats that are slowly undoing our world? And I think that's the biggest issue we face ultimately, is understanding the root causes and drivers of this, because otherwise, in the very long term, we're likely doomed. You know, on a very basic level, if you have improving technology plus arms races over the course of centuries or decades, where is it going to end? Even just with nuclear weapons, we've had a dozen near misses, and some of those were sheer dumb luck that we didn't end up in thermonuclear war. I wouldn't bank on that holding out for the space of centuries.
Yeah. And if there were a nuclear spat between two nations, India and Pakistan, for example, or other China and Taiwan, the nuclear winter that would result from that would mean that the Earth would be uninhabitable by other species and ultimately by ourselves as well, just to be clear.
Yeah, so if you took the worst case scenario here, which is essentially a thermonuclear war between the US and Russia, who hold roughly 85% of the nuclear stockpile, that would result in what's called 150 teragrams of soot going up to the atmosphere. Long story short, cities which are burning become chimneys pumping up soot into the atmosphere. That soot acts like a sponge for incoming solar radiation. It creates winter-like conditions. In this case, it will lower global temperatures between 8 to 10 degrees globally for roughly a decade. The latest modelling, published 2 years ago, suggested that roughly 5 billion people would die from the knock-on effects. It could potentially be worse. You both have numerous other species which die off, and the ripple effects across ecosystems. UV actually starts to drop, so you'd suddenly have UV ratings globally of roughly 35. You're not supposed to go outside if it's above 11. And you'd also have a very large number of people who are immunocompromised, suffering from radiation sickness, moving, the world basically becomes a petri dish. On top of all that, when a nuclear weapon goes off, it releases what's called an electromagnetic pulse, basically an expanding orb of intense electromagnetism, which fries electrical infrastructure. It's pretty likely you'd see most electrical infrastructure, at least across the northern hemisphere, go off. A lot of this is really hard to replace. So replacing an electricity transformer takes roughly 2 years. They're highly customized. Good luck doing that without any industrial supply chains. And on top of that, the internet likely goes down and can't get back up. Computers work through a border gateway protocol, which basically means they rely upon most of the system being up. So if most of the system's down, suddenly the internet's gone as well. Anyway, all those knock-on effects mean that you're probably looking at something that's potentially worse than 5 billion people being lost.
Yeah. So the nuclear threat is something that we've known about for a long time. People have spoken about the long peace, which has come about because we've had the threat of nuclear weapons. But I think what your argument is saying is that increasingly those nuclear weapons may get into the hands of states other than the dominant superpowers, and that the consequences of an accident or a mistake would be utterly catastrophic.
Yeah, so the long piece is often this idea that we've seen either a decline in war, or at the very least, no great power war since the introduction of nuclear weapons. Statistically, you'd actually have to have 100 years more of peace in order to make any statistical argument about whether or not nuclear weapons are helping. But I also like the argument of a colleague of mine in France at Sciences Po, Benoit Pelopotis, who puts forward the case that, again, we've had all these near misses, and many of them were super close and based upon luck. And if they're really just a matter of luck, it's hard to say that nuclear weapons were the defining factor here.
Yeah.
And a great example is, who's heard of Stanislav Petrov? Oh, here's a story. So in the 1970s, there was a Soviet officer standing in front of a computer console, and he saw a wave of roughly 24 missiles coming towards the Soviet Union. He faced a decision as to whether or not to escalate that information to his superior officer, who likely would have responded by sending a wave of nuclear weapons at the US. He sat there for a few minutes and eventually thought to himself, if the US is going to conduct the first strike, they'd be sending tens of thousands of nukes, not just a few dozen. They'd be trying to wipe us out completely. I'm going to assume that this is the computer glitch. Luckily, he was correct. Essentially, some clouds had messed with a satellite, and that had resulted in this kind of optical illusion. And he decided not to escalate it to his superior officer. But in retrospect, he actually ended up saying to the BBC that this was a 50-50 decision. Like, it was literally a toss of the coin as to whether or not he told his superior officer this information. So even if we do just keep the weapons to the existing 9 states around the world, I wouldn't be confident that this is going to be a stable position to be in the long term. And for the first time since the 1980s, we've actually seen nuclear stockpiles starting to rise again, and many countries, both the US and Russia, are starting to invest in new ways to deliver nuclear weapons at an increasing speed, things like hypersonic missiles. If you want to get a good idea into what could happen, there's a really good movie out recently called House of Dynamite, which is based upon really in-depth research of what would happen if a nuclear weapon actually was heading towards the US.
And could you say something about that? That's at the one end of the scale. You also, in your book, talk about killer drones as well. Yeah. Could you say a little bit more about that? Yeah,
so you may have heard of lethal autonomous weapons, aka killer robots, which are essentially different weapon systems, usually drones in this case, which can pick out, identify, and kill a target without any human approval. And these are already in use. The first recorded kill was in 2023 in Libya. And they're becoming more and more frequently used, obviously, in the case of the Ukraine-Russia war. This is the kind of thing which could potentially revolutionize warfare in the long term. And while many people thought this is a good thing, because humans, we're biased, we're full of passion and emotion, we can do stupid things when tensions run high, particularly in a warfare-type scenario, machines are cold-blooded. They can be programmed with the rules of war, and hence they'll operate in a much more kind, compassionate, and restrained manner. Unfortunately, the way we've been seeing AI used in warfare so far suggests that that probably won't be the case. Who's heard of the gospel system being used in Gaza? So essentially, it's a large algorithm which collects people's information, ranging from things like mobile phone records, movement patterns, and it tries to make a quick decision of who is most likely a terrorist or affiliated with a terrorist cell. So Israeli IDF is using this system, and essentially it spits up a whole bunch of names of different people, and then a human will usually look at it, but usually only for roughly 10 to 20 seconds, and approve of the target. They then go to a second algorithm, which basically tracks the person back to their home residence, and then when they get there, it goes to a third algorithm, which basically then drops a bomb on them. So what we see here is it's not being used for more humane warfare. It's being used to scale up war, make it quicker, more efficient, and more brutal. And I dare say that's going to be how lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots, are going to be used in the future as well. And the biggest fear, of course, is these start being used in domestic law enforcement too.
Yeah. using facial recognition
Yeah.
software. And some of these can be, some of the drone that has the capacity to kill someone can be as cheap as £5 to produce, I think.
Yeah.
So if these get into the hands of people who are wanting to do harm, there is a real risk that, thinking about geopolitics, the way that we were talking earlier about polarization, the way that things are ramping up, that it will be increasingly possible for groups to use this kind of technology in order to continue to perpetuate warfare, essentially. Yeah. Okay. So we've focused on war and conflict because I'm interested in that. That's my a topic of my research in peace education. Obviously, we also have the climate emergency as well, including things not so much discussed, such as microplastics and so on. Perhaps could you talk about the example of microplastics? Because I think it really speaks to your point about Goliath cultures and the ways that our global trading and greed is feeding into the Goliath curse.
Has anyone heard of planetary boundaries as a rough concept? Yeah, it's essentially the idea that there are different subsystems across the Earth system, and there's kind of a zone of safe human interaction with these systems. So if we have too many greenhouse gases, suddenly you start to make a more destabilized Earth system and a climate system, which can of course lead to great damage. And scientists collectively, particularly from the Stockholm Resilience Centre and the Stockholm Environment Institute, have identified 9 different planetary boundaries. One of the ones that is least discussed, but is in the kind of high-risk category, is what are called novel entities, which are essentially different synthetic compounds which don't exist naturally. They're created by humans. And this includes things like microplastics, but also things like PFAS, which is essentially a compound used particularly in like heat-resistant and flame-retardant materials. PFAS is now found in essentially water supplies across the world. If you've been in the rain recently or drunken a glass of water, you've almost certainly been exposed to PFAS. When it was created back in the 1970s and 80s, the main companies creating them, 3M and DuPont, ran a series of experiments both with rats but also looking at their own workers working with PFAS and discovered that it had a series of different effects. Workers working with PFAS were far more likely to have children that had genetic defects, for instance, particularly eye defects. And rats, and it seems like humans now as well, are far more likely to fall prey to certain cancers. So it appears to be carcinogenic as well, and it also appears to have knock-on effects in terms of declining fertility. They buried that information intentionally and then told the public that it was as safe as table salt. We now have roughly 200,000 different synthetic compounds, including PFAS obviously, that are being produced in the billions of tons every year. Most of these have very, very small safety assessments, and the safety assessments are never longitudinal. They're looking at what are the health impacts over the space of decades, and they're very rarely looking at what are the impacts when these things interact with each other, or interact with the environment, etc. So in short, we don't even really know what these things are doing or are going to do in the long term. And of course, this has led to some to speculate that this may be the big driver behind declining sperm motility and count rates across the world, and some declining fertility as well. In short, novel entities are one of these things where we just don't know how bad it could be, and that's kind of the scary thing.
Okay. So you touched there on how business interests, globalization, capitalism, how that is interacting with the greed of particular humans who are then impacting on the rest of humanity. In your book, you talk about the multi-billionaires, and you take a particular, you target them in particular. Could you tell us a little bit more about those multi-billionaires and what you think is happening at the moment?
In the book, I try to highlight that we often mistakenly think that collapse or all these big threats we face are because of human nature. It's because we're all irrevocably flawed in some way, whether it be greed or an inability to cooperate, etc., etc., parochialism. When you actually look at things like arms races, or you've probably heard of the idea of the tragedy of the commons, that if you have a common pool resource, everyone has a self-interested use to use it, and hence in the long term it will be overused. When you actually do laboratory experiments with regular people trying to do these things, the commons aren't overused. You just simply let people communicate and voila, it doesn't happen. Indigenous groups have been commonly using resources without overexploitation for hundreds of thousands of years in some cases. And likewise, you rarely see arms races occur in these kind of laboratory settings when you just have normal people being able to communicate. And we have numerous cases across history where arms races haven't occurred.
Yeah.
However, there are two groups that are far more likely to have these kinds of collective action problems. One is people in the dark triad. The second is people who are trained in finance and economics. Unsurprisingly, if you think everyone else is going to act like an asshole, you have complete free range to act like an asshole yourself. And that obviously creates a whole bunch of really bad knock-on effects. The problem with billionaires is they tend to be overrepresented in terms of both of those categories, and they also have, importantly, the resources to do great harm as well. I mentioned 3M and DuPont, for instance, and their acts of actually trying to hide the information they had about the damages of their products, and that's not exactly rare. BP, Exxon, and many other fossil fuel companies did this in the 1970s. They modeled and knew about how bad climate change could be. They admitted that the greenhouse effect was real and could cause great damage to global society. Then they intentionally buried the information and spent tens of millions of dollars running misinformation campaigns to sow doubts in the science of climate change. That's not something that most people would do. But it's something which, dare I say, probably Elon Musk wouldn't be too uncomfortable doing. We're not really selecting for the best of us when it comes to these positions. It's very difficult to look at Putin, Trump, Xi Jinping, or Bezos and Musk and think, these are really the best of us. These are really good people.
Yeah.
And importantly, these are people who have orders of magnitude more power than the average individual. 81 billionaires hold more wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity.
Yeah. This is something I talk about in my book too. And when I'm talking about the problems, which I do in the first half of my book, I'm talking about how education is complicit in creating the myth of meritocracy, for example, that if you get on, it's because you were born with brains, or you've worked hard, or you've done your homework. If you don't get on, that's either your fault or it's the fault of the teachers, that governments need to take the teaching profession in hand on behalf of the voting public, et cetera, et cetera. And so somehow we need to break out of not only these conditions of inequality and toxic ways of being in the world and creating harm, but also the ways that our own minds have been colonized to think that this is the natural order, that this is our fault, that there's no alternative, that if good people work hard, we can overcome this, that our democratic systems are capable of holding power to account. You talk about this a little bit in your book as well.
Yep.
So could you tell us why you don't feel that democracy in and of itself is capable of bringing about the changes that we're looking for?
I'll once again be very academic and say, let's talk about definitions. Democracy is not a parliamentary system like we have in the UK, one that was exported across the world through colonization roughly 150 years ago. Democracy is a spectrum from more or less inclusive forms of governance with more or less deliberation. Essentially what we're talking about is how equally shared is political power. And there's a range of different ways of doing this. It's worthwhile noting that the ancient Greeks didn't consider voting to be democratic. To them, random selection for a lottery, what was practiced in ancient Athens, that was democracy, and voting was associated with oligarchy. They would basically see our current system as oligarchy with some democratic furnishings, which I think is probably more accurate, to be frank.
Okay.
And in general, we have to think about whether or not we're even prioritizing being a good democratic system. We inherited these different democracy or democratic models from a couple hundred years ago, which were usually, to be frank, just really weird historical happenstance negotiations and compromises between elites. If you look at, say, for instance, the Founding Fathers, it's basically a bunch of very powerful men holding slaves and lots of property, discussing what's the best way of bringing together all their collective earnings without making sure the majority overrule them. And similarly, the UK Westminster system, it's not like a whole bunch of people sat down and said, how do we best do democracy? What's the best way to give power to the people? No, it was essentially a negotiation between the king and the lords until eventually the lords got more power, and then it kind of evolved from there. But we've never really sat down and actually tried to make our systems more democratic or reflected on what's the evidence for how to best do democracy. And even today, even the societies which are defending that we have to go to war because we're the bastions of democracy and freedom, they would spend at least 100 times more on facial recognition rather than improving their own democracies, whether it be voter turnout or doing things like deliberative democracy. But in the book I put forward that we have very strong emerging evidence that if you want to do democracy well, the better way is usually doing things like citizen assemblies and citizens' juries.
Yeah. So let's move on to, in the face of all of this feeling pretty inevitable and hopeless, what are the things that we can do to begin to create a different social contract, either locally, nationally, or even globally?
I can give a couple, and I want to actually hear from you in terms of what you think we can do in terms of renewing the social contract or just simply escaping the existential threats we face today. In the book I put forward, there's both a set of pretty easy interventions in some way of technically how do we diffuse all these different existential threats we face today. And to be frank, we kind of know most of them. Nuclear weapons, the key is not to have them. And we have the treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons from 2017, which roughly, I think, over 90 countries have joined now. Unfortunately, none of the actual countries which hold nuclear weapons. But we also know we can dismantle them pretty quickly. During the 90s, roughly over 1,000 nuclear weapons per year were being actively dismantled. When it comes to climate change, we have a plan for every single major economy of how they could reach net zero emissions by 2050 using either existing technology or technology that's pretty feasible in the next 2 decades. And we once again know the pretty basic policy interventions, price carbon, energy efficiency, etc. And most of our environmental problems could be solved as simply as making sure that the environmental damages and the social damages caused by companies are reflected in the price. And ultimately, while it may seem crazy and people use this to say more taxes, all you're doing is making the economy more honest. Currently, these companies are causing damages, whether it be like air pollution, which kills roughly 9 to 12 million people every year, and they're not paying for that, which they obviously should. But the bigger, deeper problem, I think, is, as we've already alluded to, inequality. If you have wealth inequality, it tends to spill over into other forms of inequality. It's pretty rare that you have a billionaire who just wants to keep their money in the bank and not buy office, use lobbyists to distort policy making, potentially buy up bureaucracy positions, or of course buy the media. And Musk is a great example here. He both used Doge to basically co-opt the bureaucracy, he got involved in an election, and on top of that, of course, he's very keen for everyone to know about him by buying Twitter. Bezos, not much better. He brought the Washington Post, Twitch, and Audible, and of course has his own army of lobbyists as well. But you can either have billionaires or democracy, you can't have both. And in the book, I go through different ways in which we can try to level each of our power structures and make sure they're kind of sustainably equal. In the case of wealth, pretty simple. Have a wealth cap of $10 million. Anything more than that, it's not about being happy, it's not about having an appropriate amount of compensation for your great genius. It's really just dangerous for the rest of society. And likewise, democracy, start to use citizen assemblies and citizens' juries, including in companies. I guarantee that if ExxonMobil, back in the 1970s, had a citizens' jury sitting next to the board when they decided to bear that information, I highly doubt the citizens' jury said, yes, please go ahead, lie to my friends and family. But in short, it's about both addressing the existential threats we face today directly, but also finding ways to address the underlying drivers, in particular by ensuring equality in the different forms of power, such as wealth and political power. But what do you think? Yeah,
so there's a couple of things that aren't to do with education, and then some things that are more specific about education. So I think universal basic income is really important. The wealth that is generated has moved so far beyond the labour of any one individual that I think we should be recognising what does each human need in order to live well, and to distribute that across the population. It's hard for any nation to do that because on what basis would you do it? Who are the citizens of your country? It would probably need to be something that would happen across different nations. But as we move into potential worklessness with AI and so on, I think universal basic income is going to become more and more important. I think that working with AI and AI is a tool. It doesn't have to be in the hands of billionaires. It doesn't have to be used as a way of colonizing our minds in the interests of capitalism. It can be used as a means of connecting us across the planet. And do you know of Audrey Tang in Taiwan? Yeah. Okay, so Audrey Tang has managed to get the trust in the government, in politics, in Taiwan from about 8% up to, I think, over 80%. And they did that by using smartphones and horizontal connections. So this is where you trust your peers and you connect across peers. And so they use both letting the government know what are the priorities of the citizens to focus on, but also voting as well on any potential actions that the government might take. So they're already using a very distributed way of making decisions across the population. So these ideas that have in the past been seen as incredibly radical, like universal basic income, or like deeply distributed democracy, or as you're saying, citizens' juries and so on. We can do these things. And Goliath, we're now in as you say in your book, we're in a globalized empire, which is our global system of capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism. And we are already seeing the decline of that Goliath. And I think what I would want to see is that through education, that we can seize the agenda so that we manage that decline in ways that bring about the more positive ways of interacting with each other that you were talking about. I particularly like your idea of restricting individual wealth to $10 million. I think that's great. Nobody needs more than that. So there are more positive ways of doing things out there. And I share your optimism around individual humans. We forget that in the First and Second World Wars, people gave their lives. They sacrificed their lives to strangers, people they never met. If you go into any town or village and you're in distress, people will look after you. The people who are going to cause harm or who are psychopathic or they're the outliers. They're not the norm. And so how do we work with the general kind-heartedness of our humans and of our communities to come together, potentially using social media and AI, in order to make those connections? I mean, we're going to hand it over to some conversation in just a moment, but I'm sure that all of us have examples of people doing things differently, either going off-grid, homeschooling, educating in different ways, educating for the whole child. People are so hungry for change. I see it everywhere I go. And this was the expression that led me to write my book about rewilding education, because I want a better education for my grandchildren. I want a better future for my grandchildren. And we need to have the courage to really think, how do we realize the future that we want? Because if we continue to just sort of leave it to the people who are in control of our societies, which are increasingly multinationals and billionaires, we are getting closer to the kind of doomsday scenario that you're talking about, as opposed to the future we could have if we start to reorganize. And I think that in Rewilding Education, I talk about teachers not as deliverers of knowledge, but as mentors and enablers of education happening, not in classrooms where all the 12-year-olds on a Tuesday afternoon are doing the same thing, but as education hubs where there are a variety of courses that are available for people across the age span, because people are going to have to re-educate, retrain themselves throughout the life course. So the role of primary education, in my view, is to equip young people with confidence, curiosity, critical thinking, the ability to collaborate, to cooperate, to reach out across the world through the internet and through other means, and to be excited by difference. If we can get 12-year-olds who are all of those things, after that, there should be an ecosystem of learning opportunities for them to participate in, whether that's doing an internship in a startup company, or in a science laboratory, or in an art gallery, or in a care home. And that our teachers can be mentoring our young people regularly to enable them to make the best of these educational opportunities. Young people could produce e-portfolios where they are able to demonstrate what they can do, rather than an exam at the age of 18 where they get this thing called an A star, which is a gateway into another education. How can we enable young people to think about education not as a commodity with cash value for future opportunities, but as a genuine, authentic, lifelong process where they're at the heart of it? And if they make a mistake and start to get obsessed with one thing and get other opportunities restricted, that it's always possible for them to come back and to re-engage with their education. I think humans who've been through that kind of educational experience will participate in citizens' juries, will hold people to account, will be excited by difference rather than afraid of it. We can't afford business as usual in our education system. It's not equipping our young people to do things differently. And that was why I wrote Rewilding Education.
I'm glad you did. I mean, education is one of the things I don't cover in the book in terms of ways forward, and I think you've done a really fantastic job of giving a whole bunch of both wonderful and pretty comprehensive ways of improving the education system. Two things I'd add just in general for existential risk in particular would be, one is kids, even though these are confronting issues, should learn about them. I've had a group of friends who were all pretty well educated, some were PhDs, master's students, over for dinner once, and not one of them knew what nuclear winter was. Like, given that the UK has over 300 nuclear weapons, you should know about this. Like, it's just very fundamental to being able to vote and basically be a citizen in this case, a nuclear-armed democracy. And second is basically trying to encourage kids to actually be democratic citizens in the first place. You know, as most of you probably know, schools were originally modelled off factories. They weren't there to create really well-functioning democratic citizens. And simply giving a little bit of history about here's how the Westminster system works doesn't really actually help children become better democratic citizens. You know, you want them ideally doing lots of group exercises where they have to share power, for instance, and make collective decisions. Potentially using some of the tools that Audrey talks about, things like Polis, for instance. If they're going to be using computers, then I think that's as good a use as any. And last but not least, there's a bit of a cultural change. I mean, we've been talking about how often people strive for status in the wrong kinds of way. That you want to have, more wealth, for instance, more power, be higher in the hierarchy. And, our education system certainly encourages that. I remember a great book called Excellent Sheep by William Dershowitz, which basically talks about exactly this, that, kids have to go through so many extracurriculars, overachieve in their subjects, all with the goal of basically just getting to the top grades, but never questioning why. And I think we have to have a cultural shift towards, what actually does make a good person that's worthy of being rewarded by the community. And we should probably be rewarding more things like virtue and kindness rather than how much can you screw over people to make money.
And we also valorize dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
So, you're grade 4, well done, you should now be thinking about grade 5. You've got a B, you need to be working for an A. And so we have continuous school improvement built into the system. Teachers are constantly being pushed to keep improving. So we build in this mindset of dissatisfaction and constant improvement and wanting the next thing into our education system. Yeah. And that basically prepares a generation of capitalists and consumers rather than young people who think about what is moderate, what is happiness, what is enough. And so our education system, I think, needs to reflect those kinds of values as well.
Agreed.
Okay, we'd be really interested to hear your ideas.
Thanks for the really great work. Big fan. So state schooling has often historically emerged to counter perceived existential threats at the time. So industrial Britain, working class unrest prompted those in power to implement mass compulsory education. Cold War technological competition drove the USA's STEM expansion. But such interventions arguably have seeded today's crises. So industrial schooling has enabled CO2 emissions, climate change, STEM acceleration has produced nuclear arsenals, and arguably the climate of current AI hyperdevelopment. So my question is, doesn't this pattern suggest that schooling, despite its unique capacity to shape generations more than probably any other social institutions, I would argue, but doesn't this pattern suggest that schooling is a necrotic institution and is actually unable to provide the education that we need rather than just reproduce power structures? And if that is the case, then what do we do today? How do we operate within current school systems to try and educate for safer futures?
You can go first if you like.
Well, okay,
that's a good one.
So I'll start by saying, well, we rewild education. So I've been involved in education for 4 decades, whether it's as a teacher or a charity worker running my own business, or latterly within academia. And I've come to the final conclusion that schools are actually beyond redemption. So I think that the structural and cultural violence is so deeply embedded within the thing that is a school, whether it's in Western democracies or anywhere else in the world. If you go into anywhere in Africa, for example, as I was discussing with Thelma earlier today, you'll get this same idea of, but we just want the school to provide a better education for my child so they get a better future. Everybody wants that for their child, but nobody is lifting their eyes above the parapet to actually see what schools are doing to us and doing to our children. So I would say I don't think we're going to get rid of state-sponsored schooling anytime soon. There's way too many vested power interests within that system. But what we can do is we can connect the dots with all of the shining examples of people who are doing things differently. We can connect them up. We can be networkers. We can be enablers. And I think what will happen is that new ways of doing education will kind of emerge in parallel. And at some point, those dominant ways of doing schooling will begin to fall away because the majority of us who have nothing to gain from modern systems of schooling will actually realise that we're investing in the wrong place. So I think it will be a falling away and then a bubbling up of something different over the next decade, I would say.
It's a huge question. I'll try to give a very brief answer. Naturally, most attempts to improve the schooling system or address a new problem tend to just deal with the immediate problem, not the underlying causes. And naturally, that tends to have a whole bunch of unintended consequences. I think there's a way of looking at, say, for instance, science and saying, well, science is just over time making things much worse. If you look at, say, for instance, weapons over the long sweep of history in terms of the amount of joules or energy they release, it's pretty clear that you go from bows and arrows to things like heavy muskets, flintlock muskets, cannons, artillery, nuclear weapons, etc. It's just a pretty clear exponential, which correlates pretty well with both increasing energy capture and increasing science. And one could say it's science doing it, but realistically, things like atomic weapons, they were big political choices to invest a huge amount of money in that. And likewise today, the US is making a very big political choice to put roughly $1.5 trillion towards modernizing its nuclear weapons and substantially less towards addressing climate change. So the way in which the education system works, of course, is a reflection of power. And the bright side is that it is a feedback loop. Education can, of course, also shape power structures. The way the education system works helps to select who's going to have more power in the future. It's a question of what are the kind of leverage points we can have to help force the power system to change, and then, of course, that becomes a hopefully virtuous cycle in which you have improving changes to the power system due to education, and that helps to improve education over time. But that being said, I think Hilary's probably right here that it's going to require pretty radical, large-scale change.
So, do we have any other questions, comments? How are people feeling? What's your visceral response to what you're hearing today?
Shaky and cold, hearing about nuclear winter.
Thank you.
Well, I'm feeling very relieved. I'm feeling relieved that we all decided to come out tonight and participate in this very important discussion. And I'm feeling very relieved that we're being heard by each other. And I've been behind lots of the ideas that we're coming up with for many a day, and I'm really pleased about being heard. I'm really pleased that these things are being discussed, and I hope that the way forward is to discuss them more with as many people as we possibly can, and to surround ourselves with like-minded people, to promote more of the good ideas that Hilary's come up with, that Luke's come up with, that we've come up with today. So I'm so relieved with this evening.
How do you see the transition happening? Because it seems to me all the power and authority resides in these minority billionaires and leaders of countries, and they're quite satisfied with status quo. It sounds like we need some sort of uprising. And is that feasible? Is that going to happen? Do we let the existential threat happen so that the whole thing comes to a head? Listening to you on nuclear winter, that doesn't sound like a good route to follow. So how do you see the transition to this new way of working and living?
That is the one where I'm least certain. I'm certainly not a seer. I know a bit around the social mobilization literature, but I don't fully know. I think there's roughly 3 paths forward here. One is you have some kind of a crisis, which essentially creates a window and opportunity for institutional change, which has historically often been the case. I wouldn't bank on waiting for a crisis. I think that's a pretty grotesque gamble in many cases. Another is you hope that a small group of individuals who are quite powerful do the right thing. I don't think that'll happen. I had some colleagues, Peter Turch and Dan Hoyer, who looked at 4 cases historically where a society appeared to be heading towards crisis but had reform. And often it did involve actually elites, very powerful people, realizing that the system needed to change. The problem was that the reforms were never very structural. They basically just more or less kicked the can down the road and delayed crisis for a couple of years. And the last is, as you mentioned, something closer to an uprising. And of course that can take multiple forms. It doesn't need to be some kind of Bolshevikian type revolution. It can be just people trying to push for more things like citizen assemblies and citizens' juries. That's ultimately the thing I have the most faith in. When you look at genuine human progress across history, it's largely down to both, yes, a little bit of technological change, but people more or less taken to the streets. The 40-hour working week, civil rights, most of the things that we actually really prize, even sanitation today, were the result of a shared struggle. And I suspect we're going to need that.
Hi, thank you. I suppose the setting that we're in is quite a sort of secular academic one. But we live in a world where most people have faith, have some kind of spirituality. And Hilary, you've written recently about kind of moving beyond rational responses. And so I was just wondering, I suppose, Luke, especially when you've been looking at previous civilizations, what role has faith, spirituality played in their destruction, or is that something you've looked at?
You can go first if you like, because you've probably written more about this than I have.
Yeah, so, okay, so disclosure, I'm a Quaker, so my passion for peace comes from the Quaker peace testimony, and I deeply value the power of silence. When humans sit together in a circle in silence, very often in a Quaker meeting, people will feel moved to stand up and speak. And when they do, they often articulate something that somebody else in the room needed to hear. There's something that happens. And I know you've got an interest in Indigenous spirituality as well. This is deep, deep, deep in our DNA. And I think our modern way of living has forced us to secularize and to edit out that way of being in the world. And for me, we need to be in balance with body, mind, heart, and spirit. And that doesn't have to imply the supernatural. Spirit can be that which connects us viscerally. And we can go back to the wisdom traditions all around the world as an antidote to what's been done to us in times of modernity. And I very much hope that we will do that.
As far as we know, essentially every culture has at least some sense of animism, that there's something beyond us, that things around us are filled with some kind of life force or spiritual energy, etc. One thing that really changes when you get Goliaths is you start to get all these stories that are based upon domination. China has the mandate of heaven, for instance, the idea that the emperor, if they rule in the right way, will create more or less a heaven on earth of sorts, but of course with them at the top. Egyptian pharaohs were either gods or a reflection of gods. Mesopotamian kings were usually represented as gods. But there was always some notion of spirituality being built upon some kind of chain of command, and that being reflected onto earth. And when you have collapses, what typically happens is the dominant ideology tends to change. In the case of Rome, obviously we have the continuation of Christianity, but typical and traditional Roman polytheistic beliefs fall apart. And if you look at, say, for instance, the fall of the Qin dynasty in China, basically legalism goes with it. So often the dominant ideology tends to change when you have these big shifts and big collapses.
Is that okay, Rebecca? Yeah.
I'm feeling annoyed because essentially what you've outlined in your discussion is that there are a whole range of issues that we've just allowed to come about, essentially. We're all complicit in this, aren't we? And that's slightly troubling, particularly given, if you take your observations around nuclear threats, how just very simply unaware people are, or blasé even, about the risks. And they're essentially outsourced it to other people to look after. And if you, as you referenced, we've been lucky, then my hypothesis listening to you is that this is going to happen in some way, shape or form. And all the other threats that you've mentioned. And so I'm trying to work out how do we then build conversations to raise awareness, engage people in conversation and get change. And surely that's where the education system, well, based on the assumption that we can use the education system to do this, is we should be addressing these issues right from the start with 5-year-olds upwards, and with adult learners as well. So that's really curious, that we're complicit, the system is complicit, and there seemingly seems to be no way out.
Can I say that a real game changer for me was actually the pandemic? Because I think I'd been brought up to believe that they, whoever they are, wouldn't let anything bad happen. That somehow, we'd bumble along and then the government basically had our best interests at heart in some way. And I think that most of us from childhood onwards have sort of carried, otherwise how would we continue if we didn't have that basic faith that they were looking out for us? And then during the pandemic, I realised that actually they haven't a clue, and they can't, they're not in control. And so I think that's partly where my journey into this work was really accelerated, because we can't leave it to the people who have power over our lives to do the right thing, actually. And I think we all kind of know that deep down, but it's become more and more visible. I think we feel like we are facing decline and collapse everywhere we look, with polarization, geopolitics, the railway, you name it. Just throw that one in. But this means that, yes, we've got Farage and Trump, and we've got threats there, but we have also got apologies for revealing my politics, but we also have got an emerging Green Party as well. And a lot of what the Green Party are calling for is very radical and actually could work. And with the new leader of the Green Party, we have somebody who's a populist, for better or worse. So it may be that we can start to galvanise behind some radical figures to think about how we might bring about change. I share your anger. I'm furious as well. But I'd like to turn my fury into trying to see what we can do.
Hi, can I pick up on the frustration and also the practicalities that you've both outlined in terms of trying to resolve for some of these issues? I don't feel clear from what you've said as to what the possible solutions might be. I share your observations. I joined CND 40 years ago thinking it was radical. I'm still a member. It frustrates me that more people aren't. And I wonder if, rather than trying to participate in democracy and picking up on the earlier question about revolution, we could be taught to be activists better. And I don't mean revolutionaries by that, but I mean actively engaged, educating ourselves if the system doesn't allow it to be given to us, if you like, and actively seeking change. Is that what you were pointing to, or an aspect of what you were pointing to, perhaps?
Yeah, so to me, activism is part of being a democratic citizen. If you're going to vote every 4 years, but you're living 9 to 5 in a workplace autocracy, you're really that democratic. And it's not even if we had citizen-central juries just waiting until you get called up. You should be taking action through being an activist, basically. So I agree completely on that count. And I think I agree in general, like, the anger and annoyance you feel is natural. I feel it as well, and it's important as well. It's important to remember that Pride didn't start as a celebration, it started as a riot. And again, not to say we actually have to have big, forceful, violent events, but people really should be angry about these things when they hear about them. And importantly, you're right, like, people are complicit to a certain extent insofar as if you know about climate change and nuclear weapons, and that's not impacting and shaping the way you vote, for instance, or the way you do activism, you're kind of accepting it.
Yeah. I think we have just one more hand here.
Thank you. I've got 2 points that kind of lead into questions as well. So firstly, and I haven't read Hilary's book, so you may mention this, but I was surprised you didn't talk about teaching nature, connection and survivalist skills as part of education. Yeah. The second point is, whilst I agree that most of us probably are not well schooled in all of the existential threats and all of the details, how do we teach people about all of this and make them aware without making people sort of totally overwhelmed and feeling hopeless and feeling that they can still be empowered to do something? And speaking as someone who is an environmental activist and has studied sustainability, I still don't think about all of the threats every day because I would go mad, and I kind of try and pick my battles and, and some of it I think forget how bad it is for self-protection on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think many people would be able to study them all and act on them all, constantly keeping them in their minds and staying sane and hopeful. So as educators of any age, how do you get that balance? Thank you. Mm-hmm.
We have to accept that there are some things that are outside of our influence and control. And so beating ourselves up about not changing those things and feeling complicit isn't necessarily going to lead to mental health and well-being. I think we are all complicit just by dint of being alive in the degradation of this planet. And we kind of need to get over that and then decide, so what is it that I stand for? What kind of a human being am I? And I'm not always going to make the best decision. Sometimes I don't put things in the recycling bin because it's too yucky, and actually I just put it into landfill. And 99% of the time I recycle assiduously. But I kind of have to stop wanting to be utterly perfect, because we live in a world where there are compromises absolutely everywhere. But my aspiration is always towards peace, it's always towards justice, it's always towards equity. And I recognize that every decision that I make every day defines who I am. And I'm looking over the course of all of my decisions to be living the best life according to my values that I possibly can. And for me at the moment, it means standing up and taking risks, using the platform that I have here. And I'm willing to do that. I've been outspoken about Michael Gove, for example, and I expect that there are political battles for me up ahead, but now is not the time for me to fail to speak out. But that's my decision based on my phase of life and my priorities. And I think that each and every one of us in this room will make their own decision about what is reasonable for us to do, how does that align with our values, and what is a contribution that we can make towards the kind of world that we want to see. And if we can support each other in that and not judge or criticize people who aren't living up to our values, but who are doing things in their way, I think we can build a community of people who are pushing back and wanting to do things differently.
Yes, this is a really important question. You don't want to be engaging in disaster voyeurism or some kind of weird kind of fear-based schooling. You know, when you're looking at these issues, I would hope that people would be not just simply saying, here's the bad things, but also, look, here are some good things as well. You know, when it comes to nuclear weapons, we do have 10,000 of them, and it could result in an absolute tragedy. But we also do have 70,000 back in the 1980s. You know, we have got rid of 60,000 weapons. That's a good news story in many ways. Likewise, climate change is going bad in a whole bunch of ways, but if you look at, say, for instance, the cost of solar PV, it's basically super exponential downwards. There's a whole bunch of good things here as well, and you want to communicate both of them, but the important thing is students should be learning about the future of their species, and they should be thinking about the greatest both threats but opportunities we face as well. And it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. And from the literature on social psychology, it seems like, in general, fear-based appeals don't necessarily paralyze people, particularly if you pair it with a message of efficacy. Essentially, here's something you can do. And I think if you're having a roll-round curriculum, that's something you'd really want to focus on, not just simply, we have nuclear weapons, but hey, here's all the things we can do as well. You know, we have rising autocracy, but here's how you can be a better democratic citizen yourself. And I think if you took that kind of approach, it doesn't mean that students would become clouded by fear or paralyzed. I think if anything, it actually may give them an even greater sense of potentially hope, at the very least to expand their horizon in terms of what they're thinking about in a very important way.
Yeah.
But yeah, as someone who does think about these things regularly, it does suck usually.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've run over by 10 minutes, but I think the conversation could keep going all night. Thank you so much for your contributions. I'm sure that the discussion on your tables was also incredibly fruitful. I'd like to keep these conversations going. This has introduced a new area into the faculty. If you feel that this is something that you'd like to keep talking about, please email me. I've said to Luke that perhaps we can link up with the Centre for Existential Risk in Cambridge and think about what can education offer in order to make sure that the important messages that are being studied over there can have impact on our education systems and on our young people. So let me know if you want to be part of that. It does feel as if we've started a conversation, but a conversation that is going to continue. I know that every single one of you here in the room today will have been changed in one way or another on the basis of this conversation. So the change is already happening, and we do have a wonderful platform here in Cambridge. Let's use it in order to unite people, good people, who want to bring about positive change. Thank you very much. You've been listening to Rewilding Education. The podcast was presented by me, Hilary Cremin, and produced and edited by Justin Hodgett. I would love to hear what you thought about the discussion. If you'd like to share your responses or join us as part of the live audience for future discussions, please stay in touch by following the Faculty of Education at Cambridge on social media. You can keep track of forthcoming events on Eventbrite, where all tickets will be available for free. Each episode of Rewilding Education is released as we host these conversations. Episodes will be available on whichever platform you get your podcasts from. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to tell your friends and colleagues about the podcast too. Thanks for listening.